In this video, I'll be talking about the Visual Basic 2005 IDE in comparison to the Visual Basic 6 environment. My name is Arjen Kulp. I've been a developer for quite a few years, working with various versions of Visual Basic before the release of .NET, and now I write code with both Visual Basic .NET and Visual C#. So in this section you can learn how the Visual Basic 2005 IDE is structured, how to perform common tasks, and you will see how your experience from earlier versions of Visual Basic should make you feel right at home. We're going to start by launching the Visual Basic 2005 IDE. We're using the Express Edition. This is a free download. The link to this is on the landing page for this video. By using the Express Edition, you can get started. It doesn't cost anything. You should register after you download it, though. There are a number of premiums and additional downloads you receive when you do that. It's a completely free download, though, so you can get started writing code right away. If you're using a higher version Visual Basic, whether it's within Visual Studio Professional or Team Edition or one of the other versions of the package, you should be able to follow along with all of these steps as well. You'll just have even more options available. So let's start by looking at the initial view of Visual Basic 2005 Express Edition. When we first launch it, by default we have the Solution Explorer and the toolbox showing over here. We're not in a project right now, so there's nothing to see in the toolbox. We'll come back to this later. Same with the Solution Explorer. It's empty at the moment because there's nothing going on in there. The start page is your view into projects that you've looked at recently. It has a number of links to get you started, such as How Do I, What's New, Starter Kits, Community Links. It's a great way to get started quickly, to really get jump-started with Visual Basic 2005. And then the headlines give you some of the recent MSDN articles. It's like a mini newsreader, basically. These are clickable links. And it actually opens up the articles right into a new pane, an actual web browser tab right inside of Visual Studio. So let's go to the File menu and create a new project. And similar to Visual Basic 6, you have a few different options for what type of project you'd like to start. The Windows application, also called a Windows Forms application, it's a typical application that shows forms and has a user interface. You can drag labels, text boxes, buttons, all that sort of thing. So it gives you a visually interactive way to work with the user. A class library, this creates a DLL. This is a reusable code that you can share with other projects or developers. Nothing executable about it, it's just code, and then you link it into your other projects. A console application does not, by default, use any Windows forms. Everything works within a DOS prompt. That doesn't mean you can't use Windows forms, but by default there are none created in the project. And the last two entries, these are a great way to get started if you're not entirely comfortable with jumping right into writing code. The My Movie Collection and Screensaver are called starter kits, and they give you a complete solution. The code's all ready to go. In fact, you can double-click this and start a new project. It will contain all of the code, has a handy README file. You can hit F5 and immediately start using them. But then the advantage is that you can make any changes you want. You've got the full source code and documentation for how it all works. So it's a great way to see how a real-world application works, start to make some changes, see how they may behave, and get your feet wet without doing a whole lot of reading first. Just jump right in there, see how it works, and start making some changes. So for the first example, let's create a Windows application. And we'll call the project Exploring VB. And this will create a new project, currently with one file in it. And you'll also see an entry for my project. We'll get back to this in just a few minutes. But it starts out by showing you the form designer, Form 1. You can, of course, rename that in any way you want to. Your properties pane, your designer. This is where you can actually drag elements like buttons and checkboxes and such. And then the toolbox, which now does actually contain some entries because now we're working on a user interface. Just like you are probably used to from Visual Basic 6 or 5, the designer pane shows you the visual representation of a form, but you can also click the code view button and see what the code looks like behind the scenes. So let's start by creating a simple user interface. You probably noticed if I move my mouse over the tab here, the toolbox flies out. If you want to keep your space as maximized as possible, you'll probably want to leave it this way. But maybe when you're working in the design view, you'd rather keep it pinned open. And you can do that with the auto hide pin right here. If I click it, it's now become an always visible pane. I can resize it left or right, but it will not close now when I move away from it. And I lost the tab along the side. So let's start by dragging a label over. Now in Visual Basic 6, I would have clicked the control, and then I get the crosshairs and I can draw the actual controls onto the form. I can do that in Visual Basic 2005, but I can also, using the text box, I'll show you if I click and drag the control, when I let go, it creates kind of a default size, a logical size of that control. I can certainly still resize it as much as I want to, but I can now drag and drop a control over and it creates a logical sized instance of that control for me. You may have also noticed when I brought this out, these little lines that appear. These are more than just visual guidelines. They actually kind of pull at the control a little bit as I'm starting to get close to the edges of the form or close to other controls. Right now I'm aligning with the bottom edge, the top edge, aligning right along the middle. This helps me keep adequate space between other controls. Instead of it being a guess, it really helps me to keep consistency with how far apart I put various controls. And finally I'll drag a button over, and even before I've dropped it, it's already showing me the left, right, up, down, the edge. These snap lines show right away for me. So I'll drop that down, and as with Visual Basic 6, I can use the Properties pane now to fine-tune the various attributes of this control. We're going to change the text property, and we're going to say echo, and we'll change the label to indicate that we're going to type a message here. Notice the snap line now. The control changed its size, and when I start to drag it again, the snap line is based on its current size. I'm going to select the form itself and resize it. So far this should be pretty familiar. Let's do this now in Visual Basic 6. I'm going to create a standard exe. And I can drag my label out here. Notice that it's the caption property and not the text property as in VB 2005. I'm kind of on my own with where controls are in relation to each other, although it does snap to the grid in its default behavior. We're going to call this the message text box, and we'll put a button under it. Call that the echo button, and resize the form accordingly. Notice how the toolbox has a very different arrangement to it. I have a handful of controls here that I work with. I can certainly add components, I can certainly add tabs to it, but it's a much more sparse view to begin with. In Visual Basic 2005, there's an awful lot more showing by default, and in fact they're already logically grouped within these various tabs. And also notice the fact that they're all visible at the same time, unlike in Visual Basic 6 where I can only have one tab showing at once. So I'm going to double click. Actually, let's set the titles here as we did in Visual Basic 6. And I'm done with the dragging the control, so let's save some space. Make this auto hide again. I'm going to double click echo, and it automatically creates an echo button click event handler. And what I wanted to do when I click echo in the form is I wanted to spit it out as a message box. And in Visual Basic 2005, we do that with the message box class, and we call the show method. Notice as I'm typing, the help that it gives me, you're certainly familiar with IntelliSense popping up. It's been expanded even more now. Right now, I'm probably more interested in just the common controls, but I can switch between this abbreviated view or showing all of the methods, all of the properties that are part of an object. So we will show a message, and what will we show? We'll show the message text box dot text property. and you'll see it appearing down here in the list as part of the IntelliSense for the message text box. I'm going to hit the right parenthesis, and it automatically filled in the rest of the word text there for me. I didn't have to finish typing it. I didn't have to click it in the list. It knew since I was on that entry, as I continued to type, instead of hitting escape to abort the IntelliSense, it knew that that's what I wanted to do, so it automatically inserted that. Let's take a quick look. From Visual Basic 6, you're probably familiar with the fact that when you use the designer, you end up with a lot of code that isn't really all that usable by itself. Let's save this project, and let's take a look at what that appears like behind the scenes. Now this is not Visual Basic code. This is its own language here. And you could certainly go in and you could make changes to this, but there's no easy way to make any change to this within the IDE itself. Now let's contrast that with Visual Basic 2005. Now by default, if I double click on, or if I single click on here and choose to view the code, all I'm seeing is my click event handler. But of course there's something else going on here that actually generated the label, the text box, and the button. So we're going to show all files in the project by clicking Show All Files. And now I've got a few other entries that weren't here before, and I have a plus minus next to the form itself. Now you see two nested files. The resx file is related to resources, but the form1.designer.vb is the hidden code, the hidden file that we normally don't need to look at, that's generated automatically, and this is where the components are created. Now don't worry about some of these attributes and values. We don't need to know exactly how they all work at this point, but do know that it is all standard code. You could go in here, you could change any of this. You probably don't want to. If you start changing it, you might affect the ability of the IDE to go back and forth between code and the designer. But I could do easy things like changing the name or the text or the tab index. All of these things can be changed pretty easily in the code. So this is where all the properties are set. This is where the objects themselves are created. It's just standard Visual Basic 2005 code. And there's no magic going on. There's no hidden attributes that aren't actually part of the code. You can view every bit of it. You can make changes to it. It's just code you can work with. So let's start the application. I'm going to click the play button to start debugging. I could also start debugging with F5. And within a few seconds, I have the application running on the machine or on the screen. And when I click echo, I have my dialog box, my message box. It says hello world. I click OK, and it returns back to the application. So I just created a very basic application in just a few minutes. Very easy to work with, very easy to drag the controls over, arrange them, the adequate spacing between them, no guesswork. The snap lines help with a lot of that. I wanted a quick show also in Visual Basic 6. If I were to, for some reason, want to make a copy of these objects, I can copy them and then paste them back down. And it asks me to create a control array, which I don't have to, but it prompts me for this on each of the controls that were part of the group. And let's say I didn't even mean to do that, and now they're part of this. I can't undo anything. I can delete them, but I can't undo anything. If I go back to Visual Basic 2005 and I go to copy and paste the controls, I have a very different experience. First of all, when I paste them, they just paste. It generates new names for them. That doesn't mean I can't do control arrays, but in general I would create those in code if that was something I was interested in doing. Now the other thing, even more powerful, is the fact that the designer now has full undo support. So I can go up, I can undo the change that I just made by dragging them, and then back to the original place where they were located, and then in fact even undo the fact that I just pasted them on the form. So now if we go back to the list of controls, there's only one instance of each of these controls on the form. So I was able to undo through all of those various levels. Makes it a lot easier to experiment with your interface, and then you can just immediately undo any changes that are not what you were looking to do.